Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to yet more Warhammer lore. Today, we are looking at a specific part of the Warhammer world, the enigmatic Southlands. The Southlands are essentially the Warhammer world's version of Africa, although, unlike the Africa of our world, almost half of the continent is covered in dense jungles, with the northern part being sandy wastelands, occupied relatively sparsely these days by a few human nations and primarily by the now undead empire of Nehekara, while the south belongs primarily to the Lizardman, although a few other races, chiefly amongst them the Skaven, have also taken up fairly permanent and considerable levels of residence in the still fairly hostile but not outright lethal parts of the jungle. Other residents include a few scattered tribes of primitive humans, a couple elven fortresses, possibly a few dwarves, although this is extremely unlikely, and I'll get to that a little bit later, and of course, as always in any part of the Warhammer world, considerable amounts of orcs, goblins, and beastmen, although these beastmen do look considerably different from the ones in the Empire. Out of all of the races currently living there, though, no one has done so for quite as long as the Lizardman. In fact, it would appear that the Southlands were once directly connected to Lustria, but during the Great Catastrophe, as it was known, a not particularly subtle name, the world was essentially shattered and the Southlands were forever divided from Lustria. However, considerable portions of the Lizardmen were currently living in the Southlands once it was, somewhat violently shattered from Lustria, which is why the Southlands has a considerable population of Lizardmen and several temple cities, of which the temple city of Zlatlan is said to have been the original foundation capital, so to say, in that particular area, and assumedly still serves as the capital of the Southland Lizardmen to this very day. The Southland Lizardmen have also had a bit of an oddity to them. You see, the Lizardmen are not particularly fond of humans, although they don't hate them either. They just see them as one of the many creatures in the Old One's plans. They're not particularly nice creatures, as they occasionally turn to chaos, which the Lizardmen are not very fond of whatsoever, and, oh, you can kind of see why, seeing as chaos pretty much destroyed their entire civilization and chased off their benevolent masters, so it's pretty obvious why the giant toad people are not particularly fond of the spiky bits. However, not all humans, have turned to chaos. As such, the Lizardmen are not overly hostile towards humans. In fact, most of the time they simply just don't give a shit, because most of the humans are on the other side of the goddamn world. Those humans that pop into Lustria, mostly Viking expeditions from Norska or Imperial trading posts or other people that have heard the rumours of cities of gold and stuff, they'll deal with them if they wander into their temple cities, but otherwise they'll primarily ignore them. The Lizardmen of the Southlands, however, seem to be far more, conversational when it comes to their hairless monkey neighbours. It would in fact appear that they had diplomatic relations with Nehekara back when it was a human civilization before it turned into a bunch of undead people. This would explain several things, like for example how Nehekaran architecture look a lot like Lizardman architecture, and where the Nehekarans got the idea of embalming their dead from. However, eventually this diplomatic relationship was cut short once the Lizardmen noticed that the Nehekarans were starting to rot a little bit quicker than humans normally did, and turned into the undead. Now, it is unclear whether or not they were able to predict what Nagash was doing, and then essentially go like, well, this guy is trouble, best cut off relationship with the entire nation, which is entirely possible because you gotta remember, the Lizardmen can kind of see the future, so that is definitively not an impossibility, or if they simply cut off relations after the Great Catastrophe that happened to the Nehekarans, where most of them were turned into the Walking Dead. And they haven't really bothered establishing any kind of diplomatic relations after that, although it should be said that they are all still far more conversational than their Lustrian cousins. They haven't established outright, like I said, diplomatic relations with Araby, which is another human faction to their north. However, an Arabian scholar by the name of Ibn Yalaba was sent into the Southlands to try and treat with them. Now, in most cases, the Lizardman would simply stab him until he stopped squirming, but in this case, not only did they not stab him until he stopped moving, but they also accepted his request for an audience. As such, Ibn Yalaba entered into direct negotiations with the Slan mage priests via a skink priest who spoke his language. During this conversation, Ibn's primary goal was to open up a trade route through the Southlands to Cathay. Essentially what he wanted was an overland trade route where the various tradesmen of Araby and other human settlements would be allowed to wander unmolested through the Southlands and onto the opposing shore. This would cut down the travel time used by merchants of goods and other niceties from Cathay considerably, and would have made the trade a hell of a lot easier, as currently they have to sail all the way around the southern tip of the Southlands. This obviously longer trip also occasionally carries with it other dangers. Sea travel in the Warhammer world is not overwhelmingly safe, as there are many very large beasties living beneath the waves that have taken a liking to man-flesh, but additionally, the High Elves have also taken a rather strong dislike to piracy and smuggling through what they consider to be their waters, and so any entrepreneuring merchant that is trying to bring goods from Cathay to Araby or vice versa might have to deal with the Elven Navy, which is not a good thing. The High Elves are not pirates, or, well, most of them are not pirates, but they will occasionally demand just a little bit of a toll, just to make it fair, because they are travelling through High Elven waters after all, or at least so the High Elves claim rather vehemently. However, Ibn Yalaba did not manage to convince the giant centuries-old toad monster to let people wander through their lands, because, well, these lizardmans are not quite as racist towards humans as the ones in Lustria, but they have still noticed that humans have a tendency to do remarkably stupid things, like, for example, turn to chaos, or turn into a nation of the undead, or just generally steal the lizardman's shit, so they figured, nah, let's not have them tramping through our backyards. That seems like a rather bad idea. But even the fact that he managed to talk to them was quite an achievement in and of itself, so perhaps, just maybe in the future, there might be the possibility of diplomatic relations being established between the nation of Araby and the Lizardmen of the Southland, which would be a pretty damn interesting thing. Though, it must also be said that even if the Lizardmen somehow agree to letting the humans tramp across their backyard, there are plenty of other factions within the Southlands that might be somewhat more hostile to the idea. For example, the massive infestation of Skaven that live in the nearby region. Ibn might have been able to talk some kind of sense with the Lizardman, but I would really like to see him try a diplomatic approach with the clan Pestilence, as that would be rather amusing. So, the Skaven have, for a very long time, had a presence in the Southlands, as they really do love to dig tunnels, and they couldn't really stop themselves, or at the very least, they couldn't really stop the slaves from continuously digging. They were just so damn eager all the time, especially while they were being whipped repeatedly. That always seemed to up their ante just a little bit, so now they have tunnels that cover pretty much the whole fucking world. However, there was a Skaven civil war, or who am I kidding? One of the countless Skaven civil wars occurred when the clan Pestilence, which was considered one of the lost clans of Skavendom, returned to, the old world after having been thrown out of Lustria by the Lizardmen. They essentially decided to head to the Southlands, which felt kind of like home, and being Skaven, they turned out to be excellent neighbours with the other Skaven clans, and with that I mean that they quickly went about subjugating the other Skaven clans and allowing them to fulfill their age-long ambitions to dig a lot of fucking tunnels while being repeatedly beaten by their new overlords. Unfortunately for Clan Pestilence, however, the Lizardmen of the Southlands proved to be just as fucking annoying to deal with as those of Lustria, and they have, for the moment, chosen to remain relatively quiet, having taken over a couple temple cities, and are just kind of chillaxing underground for the moment. One day, certainly, they will probably try and take over the rest of the Southlands, but after fighting the Lizardmen in Lustria, and fighting a massive Skaven civil war, their numbers are sorely reduced at this point in time. But the Southlands also have some more civilized residents in the form of the High Elves, who maintain a fortress known only as the Elven Fortress at the southern tip of the Southlands, and the Fortress of Dawn off the coast. These fortresses were put down here to protect elven shipping that goes from Cathy all the way back to Ulthuan against Dark Elf pirates. And they do so fairly well, providing secure bases for the very, very good Elven Navy, and the Elves, while claiming the sea area as their own, will allow other nations to pass through, although they do occasionally demand a toll on passers-by, and they're not completely above the odd bit of privateering activity should the opportunity arise. And as with most elven settlements, they're not particularly fond of outsiders, so let's say a Arabian merchant ship is sinking. The elves might help them, but in all due likelihood they're just going to dump them on the shores of the Southlands rather than taking them back home and, giving them a proper ride or even just taking them back to one of the fortresses, so they are by no means a benevolent, exclusively benevolent anyways, presence in the area, although they are a hell of a lot aggressive than their Dark Elf counterparts, or the various bands of roving locals that have invented boats. The local human natives have in fact not only invented a way to float on water, but they've also grown rather fond of eating each other and things that look like each other. As such, they can pose a rather considerable risk to any ships that have to lay anchors shortly off the coast to send foraging parties inland. And of course, even though the High Elves are patrolling the area, the occasional Dark Elf raider ship might still slip past, and trust me, you'd rather be in some brown native's cookpot than in a Dark Elf dungeon. As for other halfway civilized inhabitants, there is a possibility that there are still dwarves in the Southlands, although not very likely. There used to be a dwarven hold in the Southlands by the name of Karak Zorn. Last we really knew of it was that it was established sometimes after the Great War against Chaos, back when the dwarves and the elves were still allies. Rumours abound of the fantastic wealth of this hold. Some rumours even claim that the hold itself is constructed out of solid gold and ivory, which it's a pretty damn good motivation for most dwarves to go looking for it, but word has not been had from the hold in a very, very long time, and considering the last known survivor, quote-unquote, from Karak Zorn turned out to be a demon, one has to question whether or not it is quite the paradise it is being made out to. But we don't really know. We are not entirely sure whether the hold exists still, whether it was built to begin with. We do know that dwarves went off to found it. We know that dwarves returned after founding it. But whether or not this founding was a proper hold or just a bunch of temporary dwellings is unknown. As said, it is quite likely that it was entirely destroyed, or at the very least all of the dwarves inside of it suffered a rather uncomfortable fate. The only real hint we have is that the Lizardman records speak of considerable naughtiness going on inside of Karak Zorn, which it doesn't appear as if the Lizardman were directly involved, which, considering again that the last known survivor was a fucking demon, well, you can probably draw your own conclusions from that. Additionally, any maps the dwarves do have of Karak Zorn place it at wildly different areas, and no dwarf has been able to reach the Lost Hold, or at the very least, no dwarf has been able to reach the Lost Hold and then get back home again, which pretty much amounts to the same thing as far as the rest of dwarfendom is concerned. And even if it does exist, it is deep, deep in the steaming jungles of the Southlands, surrounded by a lizardman, orcs, massive snakes, dinosaurs, dinosaurs with weapons, angry brown natives, Skaven, and possibly demons. So yeah, it's not quite the holiday spot it used to be. And of course, speaking of orcs, there are plenty of orcs in the Southlands, although these are the savage variant. Essentially, while other groups of orcs have figured out how to bash metal into shapes that vaguely resemble swords and occasionally spears, the various orc tribes of the Southlands still use weapons made of bone, flint, and just good old-fashioned sticks, which is why they're called savage orcs. They make up for this lack of crude technology by being even angrier and even more petulantly violent than the rest of the orc species, and in fact, they consider other orcs that have embraced technology to be weak pussy orcs because they have to use iron weapon to beat the shit out of people, while they're tough enough to just use good old-fashioned wood and rocks, which is certainly far more orcish in their minds. This single-minded determination also gives them a measure of magical resistance, as they are completely convinced that by smearing themselves with blue war paint made primarily out of mastodon spunk, they can protect themselves against magic, and with enough orcs in the same area all believing the same things, then voila, it protects them against magic. They also demonstrate a rather ingenious lack of self-awareness or, survival instinct in their various fighting ways, essentially just throwing themselves directly at the enemy, screaming really, really loudly, and having a general stab at beating the shit out of them before themselves have their skulls bludgeoned in. This is perhaps best represented in their unique weapon, the Big Stabber, which is essentially a tree trunk with a large piece of flint tied to one end, carried by a few dozen orcs, that they use essentially as a giant battering ram to stab large dinosaurs. It is not the safest mode of hunting large carnivorous creatures, but it is certainly effective, or at the very least the orcs can certainly make it effective. As to the specific reason why savage orcs do not have metal crafting technology and other orcs do, it is not entirely because savage orcs consider any orc that needs a metal weapon to kill something to be a bit of a wanker, but it's also suggested that large groups of orcs were used as slaves by the Chaos Dwarves, where they were taught basic metalworking, essentially just to make them better slaves, which seems like a halfway decent hypothesis considering the Chaos Dwarves did capture an absolute arse-ton of greenskin and then eventually lost them again during the Greenskin Rebellion, so as far as theories goes, this one is reasonably good, and heavens knows the Savage Orcs were wandering all over the place, so there is certainly the possibility that the Chaos Dwarves could have come across them fairly easily. As to whether or not the Chaos Dwarves would have taught their slave population how to make weapons is probably less likely, but it's also necessary to remember that as far as an orc is concerned, if it's heavy enough, it's a weapon, so the sheer fact that it's made out of metal is not so much of a hindrance to his abilities of making weapons as a hindrance to his sheer physical strength. Essentially, if an orc can lift something, he can bash you over the head with it. All in all, the Southlands is certainly one of the more uncomfortable areas of the Warhammer world, partially due to the inhabitants being somewhat hostile, and partially due to the fact that it's a bloody jungle, which is not the nicest of places to begin with, and when you add in the fact that this is a fantasy universe where giant dinosaurs are wandering around nobbling up various tourists and massive snakes are slowly but surely digesting Mowgli somewhere in this place, it all turns out to be a somewhat unfortunate place to visit unless you happen to be Clan Pestilence, or Lizardman, or Orcs. And with that, this week's lore video is finished. Until next time, I've been Arch, thank you very much for watching, and I do hope to see you again soon. Have a good day.